Hello everyone, and welcome back to MrDarXnights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep. So before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's get comfortable and begin. December 6th, 1991. The scent of burnt sugar and blood drifted through a quiet Austin neighborhood as fire crews broke into a small yogurt shop, only to discover a nightmare the city would never forget. For young girls, bound, brutalized, burned beyond recognition. And yet, over 3 decades later, the question still haunts the shadows. Who really did it, and why? Tonight, we return to that cold night, not just to remember the victims, but to uncover the chilling truth buried beneath layers of lies, silence, and smoke. Turn down your lights. This one isn't just a murder mystery. It's a wound that never healed. The winter air in Austin carried a quiet stillness that Friday evening, the kind of gentle calm that settled in neighborhoods just before the holiday season. December 6th, 1991, wasn't marked by any storm or catastrophe at first glance. It was just another mild night in Texas, with families out shopping for Christmas gifts, teenagers laughing at the mall, and local businesses winding down for the weekend. In the heart of the city, a small strip mall stood tucked away like so many others. Humble, forgettable. Among the shops was a cheerful little place called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. A bright sign, colorful interior, and the warm hum of laughter often filled the space. It was run, in part, by teenage girls looking to earn some extra cash during their high school years. That night, 4 young girls happened to be working and hanging out there. Amy Ayers, Jennifer Harbison, her sister Sarah, and Eliza Thomas. Each of them was young, full of promise, and entirely unaware that they were living the final hours of their lives. The shift started like any other. Jennifer and Eliza were working the closing duties. Sarah and Amy had joined them later after attending a mall hangout and getting a ride back to the yogurt shop to wait for a lift home. They were planning a sleepover afterward, laughing, teasing, sharing stories. The shop had experienced its usual steady stream of customers, many stopping in after dinner. Most had no idea that their quick dessert stop would be the last time anyone would see those girls alive. A few customers remembered 2 men sitting in the corner of the shop, behaving oddly. They stayed long after most had left, whispering quietly, and then, just like that, the lights went out and the store closed for the night. What happened between the last customer leaving and the fire department being called remains one of the most disturbing gaps in any unsolved American murder case. At approximately 11:48 p.m., a passing patrol noticed smoke seeping from the yogurt shop's rooftop. Firefighters arrived within minutes, believing they were simply responding to a small interior blaze. But what they found inside would change the city forever. As the flames were extinguished, 4 bodies were discovered in the back of the shop, so badly burned that their identities weren't immediately confirmed. The scene was chaos. Melted countertops, scorched equipment, water pooling on the floor from fire hoses, and the unbearable stench of gasoline and something else. Something deeply wrong. Police were immediately summoned, but the destruction made evidence collection nearly impossible. A single bullet casing survived the fire. The register had been emptied, but most horrifyingly, the victims showed signs of having been bound, gagged, and subjected to extreme violence before being shot and set ablaze. Among them, 15-year-old Amy Ayers had 2 gunshot wounds. The second shot, fired into her head, suggested that even in her last moments, she had been conscious, suffering, aware. The attack wasn't just about robbery. It felt deliberate, cold, calculated, and deeply personal. News spread fast. By morning, parents were screaming outside police lines, sobbing into one another's shoulders. Reporters hovered with cameras, their voices trembling. Local television stations interrupted regular programming to share the horrifying headline. For girls, a yogurt shop, execution-style killings, and no suspects. Austin, a city that took pride in its creative charm and community spirit, now carried a scar no amount of art, music, or warm Southern hospitality could ever cover. The police were overwhelmed. This wasn't a crime that followed logic. No forced entry. No clear motive. The girls hadn't been robbed of jewelry. There was no definitive timeline. Investigators began questioning every male in the area who'd ever visited the shop, including a few teens with minor criminal records. The search widened, and with it came the weight of public panic. Parents were suddenly afraid to let their daughters work late. Teens stopped hanging out in strip malls. People watched strangers more closely, locking doors in broad daylight. A quiet fear began to spread, a kind that outlasted even the gruesome nature of the crime itself. As the days turned into weeks, the city's grief transformed into frustration. Rumors began to swirl. Some whispered of cults, others blamed outsiders. There were theories about revenge, about jealousy, even about police corruption. None of them stuck. None of them made sense. And while flowers were placed outside the blackened storefront and memorials were held in candlelit vigils, the weight of an unanswered crime became heavier with each passing day. Families were left with empty bedrooms and a silence that screamed every time the phone didn't ring. In those early weeks, one thing became painfully clear. The yogurt shop wasn't just burned. It had been erased. Every trace of truth, every fingerprint, every drop of evidence that might have given a name or a motive had been melted in the heat of an arson so precise, it seemed made to kill not only the bodies, but the story. And still, somehow, the shadows of that night remained. They lingered in police records, haunted the minds of firemen and detectives, and clung to the hearts of grieving families who refused to let their daughters be forgotten. Throughout the day, the yogurt shop had experienced a steady flow of customers. Families stopping in after dinner, high school students enjoying a casual hangout, and neighbors treating themselves to a sweet indulgence before the weekend. It was a familiar routine. Employees greeted patrons with cheerful smiles, wiped down counters, and scooped soft serve into plastic cups under the hum of fluorescent lights. Nothing about the day suggested the horror that would follow. By late evening, only a handful of people remained in the store, and the flow had slowed to a trickle. The shop was preparing to close for the night, with the last few transactions ringing through the register. The girls inside, Jennifer Harbison, Eliza Thomas, Sarah Harbison, and Amy Ayers, had no reason to suspect anything unusual. They were simply finishing up their day. Several witnesses would later recall being in or near the shop during the final hour of its operation. Among the last customers were two men who seemed out of place. Descriptions varied slightly, but most remembered them as young, possibly in their late teens or early 20s, and behaving oddly. They lingered longer than most customers, speaking in hushed tones, glancing around frequently, and offering vague answers when asked if they needed help. One customer even recalled a feeling of unease upon leaving, something instinctual, a momentary chill that brushed past like a whisper before being forgotten. But there was no confrontation, no shouting, no overt sign of danger. Just two silent figures, watching, waiting. The last confirmed transaction on the register was logged at 11:03 p.m. That timestamp would become a critical marker in the investigation. It indicated that someone had purchased something less than an hour before the fire was reported. What happened in the window between that final purchase and the ignition of the fire remains the darkest unknown in the entire case. Somewhere in that small frame of time, the shop transformed from a place of laughter and light to one of unspeakable brutality. And the only people known to be inside during that time were the 4 teenage girls and the unidentified individuals who had yet to be found or fully identified. Investigators would later theorize that the attackers may have waited until the shop was closed or near closing before acting. It was common for employees to keep the door unlocked during cleanup duties, especially if someone was still expecting a ride or finishing tasks. The attackers could have stayed hidden, entered just before lockup, or never left at all. There were signs the girls had been caught off guard, restrained with strips of clothing and their own materials from a shop, suggesting the perpetrators acted with speed and force. There were no broken windows or signs of forced entry. Only the chilling implication of trust betrayed or a vulnerability exploited in the last minutes of the night. The discovery of a back door propped open was another troubling clue. It raised questions. Had someone exited that way to escape? Was it left open during the crime as a planned escape route? Or had it been carelessly left ajar during the chaos? The open door hinted at movement, urgency, maybe even a second perpetrator leaving quickly after the fire had been set. It also contributed to the rapid spread of the flames once the blaze was ignited. The arson wasn't just an afterthought. It had purpose. It was meant to destroy not only the victims, but every shred of evidence left behind. Accelerants had been poured around the bodies and across the floor, guaranteeing that the flames would consume everything. Whoever did this didn't want to leave questions. They wanted silence. Witnesses who lived nearby told authorities they hadn't heard any gunshots that night, which investigators speculated might be due to the use of a small caliber weapon, possibly a .22. Suppressed sound or the insulation of the building may have concealed the noise. The method of execution pointed to control. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was systematic. The girls had been positioned, violated, murdered, and then burned. It was violence inflicted in stages, step by step, by someone with the resolve to carry it out. The crime bore a cruelty that felt almost ritualistic, not in the spiritual sense, but in the methodical way it unfolded. Despite the presence of other businesses nearby, no one claimed to have seen the perpetrators leave. No one noticed anyone running. No vehicles speeding away. No cries for help. The yogurt shop was tucked in a modest strip mall, with little foot traffic at that hour. The nearby businesses had closed hours earlier, and the parking lot lights were dim, creating pockets of darkness where figures could disappear unnoticed. It was the kind of place where quiet came easy at night, where the absence of sound was mistaken for peace. For detectives, reconstructing those final moments became a painstaking effort of collecting slivers of witness statements, cross-referencing receipts, and analyzing every footstep traced across the charred floor. But it was all speculation without the missing link the moment the violence began. Who turned off the lights? Who locked the door or didn't? Who stood over the register, over the girls, over the flames? In those final irreversible minutes, something unspeakable happened in that small shop. A decision was made, and 4 lives were erased with such cruelty that the remnants were hardly recognizable. And then the killers vanished. The fire call came in shortly before midnight. What was initially believed to be a routine commercial blaze quickly escalated into something far more chilling. As firefighters entered the yogurt shop, they were immediately met with a dense wall of smoke, thick and suffocating, curling upward from behind the counters and back room. Within moments of dousing the flames, a grim realization took hold. This wasn't just a fire. There were bodies. 4 of them, unrecognizable at first glance, burned, charred, lifeless. What should have been the remnants of a small dessert shop instead resembled a war zone in miniature, a scorched ruin where something monstrous had taken place. The victims had been piled in a tangled mass at the back of the shop. There was an unnatural stillness to the scene that unsettled even the most experienced responders. The bodies were not only burned, they had been positioned. Clothing was stripped or used as makeshift restraints. One victim, later identified as Amy Ayers, had been found slightly apart from the others, with injuries that indicated she had suffered more than 1 gunshot. The others had all died from similar execution-style wounds. The way they had been left, combined with the extent of the fire damage, suggested a specific intent: obliteration. Not just to kill, but to erase. Investigators quickly determined that the fire had been set deliberately, with accelerants likely used to speed up the destruction. The pattern of burn marks across the floor and fixtures supported this. It was clear that whoever committed the murders had taken time to soak the surroundings, ensuring a fast, hot burn. The flames had been strong enough to melt plastic and distort metal, but it was the human remains that bore the brunt of the inferno. Detectives and forensic specialists now faced an impossible task: reconstructing a crime scene that had been practically incinerated. Amid the ashes, a few fragile pieces of evidence survived. A single .22 caliber shell casing lay near the bodies, blackened by soot but intact. This small fragment would later play a central role in connecting theories and timelines. but at the time, it was simply a puzzle piece without a picture. Near the register, the cash drawer had been emptied. It raised the obvious question: was robbery the motive? But too much about the scene contradicted that idea. The violence was too personal, the brutality too layered. Robbers typically didn't bind and burn their victims. They didn't linger long enough to set fires and destroy everything afterward. Other small details hinted at the killer's mindset. No significant fingerprints were recovered. Either the perpetrators wore gloves or the heat had destroyed any prints that might have been present. There were no footprints to follow, no blood trails leading away, nothing that offered a clear lead. The security of the shop had been compromised, but not obviously. There was no broken glass, no sign of forced entry, no kicked-in door. This led detectives to suspect that the killers had either been let in voluntarily or had entered before closing, hiding into the right moment to strike. The position of the bodies, the manner in which the fire had been set, and the careful elimination of physical evidence all pointed to planning. It was not a crime of opportunity. It was calculated. That realization was perhaps the most disturbing. Someone had walked into a place run by teenagers, waited patiently, and then enacted a level of violence so thorough that even identifying the victims became a challenge. There was no panic, no mess left behind that typically accompanies hasty crimes. Only devastation and silence. The presence of gasoline in multiple parts of the shop further complicated matters. Investigators struggled to determine whether the accelerant had been brought in beforehand or taken from the scene. There were no containers found nearby, suggesting that the fuel may have been poured from a vehicle outside or carried in something that was removed afterward. This pointed again to premeditation. The killers didn't just stumble into the yogurt shop. They had come equipped with a plan and with tools to finish what they started and make sure the evidence never spoke. As crime scene technicians continued their analysis, one thing became painfully clear. The girls had not only been murdered, they had been dehumanized. The fire wasn't just about concealment. It was symbolic, as though the killers had wanted to erase the victims' very existence, to reduce them to ash and silence. The combination of execution, arson, and the absence of clear motive or physical evidence made the case feel less like a homicide and more like a calculated message. But to whom and why, no one could say. Public reaction turned swiftly to horror and disbelief. Families arrived at the scene only to be told that identification would take time, that dental records and forensics were necessary to confirm who had died. Parents, friends, and neighbors were left to wait in agony as the authorities tried to piece together a picture from a canvas that had been all but incinerated. And as the sun rose over Austin the next morning, the yogurt shop stood blackened and hollow, its sign still intact above a crime that no one had seen coming. Behind its ruined windows, the echoes of that night lingered, mute, scorched, and heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. The days that followed the discovery of the crime brought a wave of grief that swept through the city of Austin like a storm without warning. The community was stunned, paralyzed by the nature of the murders and the youth of the victims. For teenage girls, each with futures just beginning to unfold, had been ripped from their families in a way so brutal that it defied understanding. Memorials were held, flowers piled outside the burned storefront. Local churches opened their doors to grieving families and classmates, trying to make sense of something that had no logic. But beneath the grief, fear was beginning to take hold. A city known for its creativity, music, and laid-back charm now had a darkness stitched into its streets. Parents became cautious. Young girls stopped taking late shifts. There was an unspoken understanding that something evil had happened and that it could happen again. The police faced enormous pressure. The public demanded answers, and rightly so. For murders in one night, all unsolved, was not something any city could afford to let linger. A task force was created immediately, composed of local detectives, forensic experts, and state investigators. Leads were scarce from the outset. The arson had done more than destroy evidence. It had obscured the entire timeline of the crime. The forensic team attempted to analyze what they could from the charred remains of the shop. Burn patterns, structural damage, chemical traces of accelerants, all were noted and logged. But there was no clear breakthrough. No weapon was found. No DNA had survived. No witnesses had seen anyone flee the scene. Investigators began by interviewing everyone connected to the victims. Family members, classmates, co-workers, customers from that night. Anyone who might have seen or heard something. Descriptions of the two strange men from earlier in the evening were gathered, but they were vague at best. Composite sketches were drawn up, but with no names, no solid leads, and no suspects. They served more as a psychological placeholder than an investigative tool. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses was reviewed, but none pointed clearly to anyone leaving or entering the yogurt shop after hours. The lack of hard evidence was not just a setback. It was a gaping hole that swallowed any real progress. Some theories began to circulate inside law enforcement circles. The idea that the murders were the result of a robbery gone wrong was considered, but quickly dismissed by many on the task force. The money taken from the register was a small amount, and the level of violence didn't match a simple stick-up. Others speculated that it could be gang-related or a cult act, though those claims were largely based on the brutality of the crime rather than any actual connections. There was also the troubling possibility that it had been personal, someone with a vendetta or a sick fascination. But nothing pointed clearly in any one direction. Each theory had holes, and none led to anyone who could be charged. Public pressure continued to mount. The families of the victims, especially, were vocal in demanding justice. They appeared at press conferences, pleading for answers and offering rewards for information. The Harbisons, in particular, became symbols of the case's impact, losing not one, but two daughters in the same act of violence. The media covered the case extensively, and the yogurt shop murders soon became one of the most watched and discussed crimes in Texas. News anchors described the scene in hushed tones. Newspaper articles detailed every grim discovery, and radio stations played somber tributes. But even as awareness grew, the investigation stood still. Detectives began using criminal profiling as a tool, bringing in experts to create psychological sketches of the possible killers. The profile described someone likely young, possibly with a history of juvenile offenses, familiar with the layout of the store, and possessing a disturbing level of emotional detachment. There were also discussions around the likelihood that more than one person had been involved. The timing, the control required, and the method of restraint used on multiple victims suggested coordination. But without more concrete evidence, it remained speculation. No fingerprints, no eyewitness accounts, no solid trail. The case's complexity was compounded by the overwhelming emotional weight it carried. Every detective, every technician, every officer on the task force felt the intensity of the assignment. It wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about answering for an entire city that was grieving and terrified. Yet, even with daily meetings, hundreds of interviews, and countless man-hours spent poring over records, no arrests were made. As the days turned into weeks, frustration seeped in. People began questioning the competence of the investigation. Rumors of mistakes and mismanagement started to circulate. Whispers of evidence lost, suspects overlooked, and missed opportunities created a sense that the window for justice was starting to close. Despite the best efforts of those involved, the investigation into the yogurt shop murders was beginning to falter. The forensic limitations of the early 1990s, the damage caused by the fire, and the absence of credible eyewitnesses created a nearly impenetrable wall around the truth. Leads came in, but none stuck. Tips were followed up, but none delivered. And while the public lit candles and left teddy bears outside the scorched remains of the store, behind closed doors, investigators were left chasing shadows, trying to solve a crime that seemed to vanish the moment it was committed. As the weeks turned into months, the case grew colder, though the public's interest never faded. The yogurt shop murders had become more than just a local tragedy. They were now a haunting national headline, referenced in news specials, crime shows, and investigative features. Still, no arrests were made, and no suspects were named with confidence. The longer the silence stretched, the more frustration built within the community. Doubts began to fester not only about the nature of the crime, but about the investigation itself. Questions were raised about early missteps. Why no one had been able to identify the strange men seen in the shop. Why surveillance footage from nearby businesses yielded nothing useful. And why some early witness accounts seemed to have been disregarded or forgotten in the rush to find suspect. Forensic limitations also weighed heavily on the case. DNA technology in the early 1990s was far less advanced than it would become in later decades. Samples from the scene were limited due to the fire damage, and what little was preserved offered no immediate matches to anyone in the system. Efforts to cross-reference prints or hair samples failed to yield conclusive results. Even the shell casing found near the bodies, a potential goldmine of ballistic evidence, turned up little in the way of useful information. With no murder weapon, no identifiable prints, and no security footage showing a clear view of who entered or exited that night, investigators were left relying on psychology, theory, and community tips, none of which were enough to break the case open. Still, names began to surface. In an effort to generate leads, law enforcement widened their scope, re-interviewing individuals with prior arrests for violent crimes, known offenders in the area, and even young men who had once worked at or frequented the yogurt shop. The investigation started to hinge more and more on interrogation techniques, subtle pressure tactics, and long hours in interview rooms. Detectives hoped someone might crack, confess, or give up an accomplice. But without physical evidence to back up a confession, the risk of wrongful accusations loomed large. Every step had to be careful, methodical, yet pressure from the public and media demanded speed and results. It was a dangerous combination. Eventually, tips led police to 4 young men who had reportedly bragged about involvement in the killings. They were teenagers at the time of the murders, and their backgrounds were rough, troubled family lives, minor run-ins with the law, and a reputation for hanging around the wrong places. Over time, 2 of them, Maurice Pierce and Michael Scott, were brought into custody for questioning. What followed was a grueling process of interrogations that would later come under heavy scrutiny. In particular, Michael Scott's confession would become a centerpiece of controversy. Under intense questioning, with no lawyer present, Scott eventually admitted involvement in the crime, naming others as co-conspirators. His statement was graphic and chilling, but it was also riddled with inconsistencies and, some would argue, coercion. There were discrepancies between Scott's confession and the known facts of the crime scene. Details he gave didn't always match what investigators had determined through forensic analysis. Moreover, there was no physical evidence tying him or any of the other accused men to the yogurt shop. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses placing them at the scene. Despite this, charges were filed. The public, desperate for resolution, saw it as a long-awaited breakthrough. But some legal experts and civil rights advocates were already raising concerns. The entire case, they warned, might be built on unreliable confessions extracted under duress. And if the wrong people were arrested, the real killers were still out there. Trials followed, marked by emotional testimony, shaky confessions, and heated debates over police tactics. Convictions were initially secured, but they wouldn't last. Over the years, as DNA testing technology improved, samples from the crime scene were reanalyzed. The results were troubling. DNA found on one of the victims did not match any of the men who had been charged. The evidence that had once been considered the key to closing the case now cast a shadow of doubt over the entire prosecution. Appeals were filed, convictions overturned, and the accused were eventually released. What was supposed to be justice became another chapter in the long, painful saga of failure and unanswered questions. The families were devastated. They had believed that the nightmare was finally over, that someone would pay for what had been done. Instead, they were forced to confront the possibility that years had been spent chasing the wrong suspects, and that the people responsible were still free. The city, too, felt a resurgence of unease. If the convictions had been wrong, then everything had to be re-examined from the beginning. Old evidence had to be revisited, leads re-evaluated, and witnesses recontacted. But time had eroded memories. Some witnesses had moved away. Others had died. The emotional toll on everyone involved was immeasurable. With no conclusive answers, the yogurt shop murders drifted back into the limbo of unsolved crimes. Cold case investigators continued to pursue new angles as technology allowed, but nothing brought them closer to definitive justice. The case became a grim example of what happens when horror meets flawed process, where the desire for closure runs headlong into the harsh reality of incomplete evidence. And so the memory of that December night in 1991 lived on, not only in the charred remains of the yogurt shop, but in the echoes of mistakes, lost opportunities, and the enduring grief of those left behind. In the years that followed the initial arrests and eventual releases of the accused men, the yogurt shop murders took on an almost mythic quality within the world of unsolved crimes. They were often cited in law enforcement seminars as a case study in investigative failure, how evidence can be compromised, how pressure can lead to rushed decisions, and how even the best intentions can result in wrongful accusations. The case haunted those who had worked on it, particularly those who had once believed they were closing in on the truth. Every overturned conviction, every news report that cast doubt on the official narrative was a painful reminder that justice still hadn't been served. Cold case detectives inherited boxes of files, evidence photos, partial transcripts, and degraded forensic samples. Despite having new tools at their disposal, including advanced DNA profiling, digital record keeping, and geographic profiling software, they were still working with the same burned-out shell of a crime scene and the same lack of definitive links to any surviving suspects. The biggest breakthrough in the case, the DNA profile found on one of the victims, remained unmatched. It was submitted to national databases, cross-referenced with known offenders, and compared with countless samples over the years. But no hit ever came. It was as if the killer, or killers, had never existed in any official system. That one anonymous DNA profile became both a beacon of hope and a source of frustration, dangling the possibility of answers just out of reach. New investigators tried to piece together the fragments of a case that had become more legend than active inquiry. They re-interviewed original witnesses, many of whom had moved on or forgotten key details. Some had even passed away. Others remembered the events too vividly, their memories now steeped in trauma and time. What they recalled no longer aligned perfectly with the original police reports. A few even admitted to confusion about what they'd seen that night, raising the possibility that early witness statements had been unintentionally skewed or influenced. Such realizations only deepened the sense that the investigation had been flawed from the very start. A broader problem persisted as well, the contamination of public memory. Over the years, speculation, documentaries, crime novels, and countless internet theories had all rewritten the narrative in different ways. Amateur sleuths offered theories ranging from serial killers to occult rituals, and each had a following. Online message boards became archives of obsession, where armchair detectives picked apart photos of the crime scene, analyzed police transcripts, and debated the meaning behind each piece of scorched evidence. Some theories gained traction, prompting fresh tips and new lines of inquiry, but most ended in dead ends. These rabbit holes often distracted from legitimate avenues of investigation, flooding detectives with irrelevant leads or recycled accusations from the past. The families of the victims continued to endure the slow ache of not knowing. They had been forced to live through the arrests of suspects they were told were responsible, only to see those men walk free again. They had watched as the case was picked apart on national television, as their daughters' names were used to fuel media cycles, and as justice drifted further away. Some parents tried to stay involved, attending every new hearing, pushing for accountability, demanding that investigators never let the case fall into obscurity. Others withdrew entirely, choosing silence over the pain of another false hope. The emotional impact remained immeasurable, layered with grief, anger, and exhaustion. Meanwhile, the physical evidence sat in storage, tightly secured and meticulously cataloged. Technicians continued testing new methods on the preserved items, hoping for even the smallest breakthrough. However, fire had robbed them of so much. The accelerant had warped materials beyond recognition. The bodies had been burned beyond normal forensic identification. Even the shell casing recovered from the scene could only confirm the caliber of the weapon, not the identity of the shooter. With every passing year, that evidence degraded just a little more, threatened by time and decay, despite the best preservation efforts. The window for solving the case using traditional means seemed to be closing. Law enforcement also faced a new kind of skepticism from the public. Trust had eroded. The mishandling of the initial investigation, the controversial interrogations, and the overturned convictions all contributed to a lingering distrust of official narratives. When cold case updates were issued, they were met with guarded optimism at best. The public no longer wanted reassurances, they wanted results. Each press conference that ended with "we're still working on it" only widened the gap between law enforcement and the grieving community. Some officers acknowledged this reality, while others became defensive, doubling down on the belief that the right men had been arrested originally, regardless of what the DNA said. In truth, the yogurt shop murders had become a symbol of lost innocence, of investigative errors, and of a community forever marked by violence. It wasn't just about who committed the crime anymore. It was about how easily justice could go astray when fear, politics, and human error collide. And as time passed, the case continued to live on, not just in cold case files or documentaries, but in the quiet, unanswered questions that lingered in the hearts of everyone who remembered that December night in 1991. The seventh section of the yogurt shop murder story returns to the increasingly complicated legacy of the case, a narrative shaped not only by grief and investigative failure, but also by the growing mistrust between law enforcement, forensic science, and public perception. By the early 2000s, the story had evolved into something far greater than just an unresolved quadruple homicide. It had come to represent the limitations of the justice system when faced with extreme pressure, imperfect technology, and human error. While investigators continued to cling to hope through DNA advancements, each new year, without closure, brought another layer of skepticism. One of the primary frustrations in the case was the unknown male DNA recovered from the crime scene, a piece of biological evidence found on one of the victims. This DNA, preserved through forensic diligence, was repeatedly tested as technology progressed. It was run through the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a vast database containing DNA profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees across the country. Yet every query yielded the same response: no match found. That single fragment of genetic material held the power to either implicate someone definitively or clear the names of those wrongly accused. But without a hit in the database, it remained a ghost, a tantalizing but mute witness to the violence of that night. Meanwhile, the legal system continued its uneasy reckoning with the confessions obtained during the original investigation. The public had once celebrated those confessions as the beginning of justice, but with their collapse came broader implications. Legal analysts, criminal justice reform advocates, and forensic psychologists began to examine how the confessions were obtained. The methods used in the interrogations, long hours, emotional pressure, misleading suggestions, were eventually cited in various professional reviews as examples of coercive tactics. The accused were young, frightened, and often without legal counsel present, creating the perfect storm for a false confession. What had once seemed like the answer to an impossible question now appeared to be a critical misstep that derailed the entire process. The case also raised a larger concern. How could the system prevent something like this from happening again? Across the country, police departments began implementing reforms to their interrogation practices. Recording of interviews became mandatory in many jurisdictions, and law enforcement agencies were urged to receive training in non-coercive interview techniques. But for the yogurt shop case, these changes came too late. The damage had already been done. Years of investigative resources had been spent pursuing leads born from questionable confessions. And with those suspects cleared, it meant starting from scratch in many ways. Reopening leads long considered closed, re-interviewing individuals whose memories were no longer reliable, and working under the burden of public distrust. The media also played a pivotal role in shaping the outcome of the case. News outlets, eager to cover each twist and turn, sometimes amplified unverified theories or highlighted sensational elements over factual accuracy. As a result, the narrative presented to the public often diverged from the actual investigative timeline. In some instances, critical context was lost. What was speculation became assumed truth. Crime documentaries and dramatized reenactments, though effective in reigniting interest in the case, often introduced distortions or emphasized specific suspects while ignoring contradictory evidence. This public storytelling created confusion, leading some viewers to believe that the case had already been solved, while others believed the truth had been deliberately hidden. Families of the victims continued to feel the weight of this chaos. Not only were they dealing with the enduring pain of loss, but they were also subjected to the relentless media cycle. Every new development meant reopening old wounds, reliving traumatic moments, and being asked to provide public statements when all they wanted was privacy and peace. Some family members spoke out more frequently, using their voices to call for renewed efforts and public attention. Others retreated from the spotlight, unwilling to be part of what the case had become, an endless loop of theories, speculation, and broken promises. Despite these challenges, hope lingered in the belief that forensic breakthroughs could eventually bring answers. Advancements in familial DNA searching, where investigators attempt to identify relatives of an unknown DNA profile, began gaining traction. These techniques had helped solve decades-old cold cases across the United States, including the arrest of the Golden State Killer. For a moment, there was renewed optimism that the same technology could identify the person connected to the unknown DNA in the yogurt shop murders. However, even with familial DNA testing, results remained inconclusive. The sample appeared to be from someone with no known relatives in any law enforcement database, making the match elusive once again. As the case dragged on, it also began to draw attention from criminal justice academics and researchers. It became a frequent subject in university courses on forensic science, criminal law, and ethics. Lectures discussed the weight of investigative responsibility, the psychological mechanisms behind false confessions, and the ripple effects of systemic failure. Scholars pored over court transcripts, analyzed the evolution of public discourse, and used the case to argue for reforms in everything from evidence handling to media accountability. The yogurt shop murders had become a benchmark, not just for the horror it represented, but for the questions it forced society to confront. In the shadows of all this academic, legal, and media examination, the victims remained frozen in memory. Each girl, Amy, Sarah, Jennifer, and Eliza, represented a stolen life filled with unfulfilled dreams. They were no longer just names in a case file. They had become symbols of what happens when truth becomes tangled in error, when justice is delayed not by lack of effort, but by flawed execution. And while investigators continued to work quietly in the background, the city of Austin waited, still carrying the weight of a night that had never fully passed. By the time the second decade since the yogurt shop murders began to pass, the case had transformed into a historical scar on the city of Austin, a constant reminder that justice delayed is often justice denied. Generations had come and gone, and the once vivid horror of that December night in 1991 had softened in the public consciousness, replaced by a quieter, more insidious tragedy. The realization that some answers may never come. Investigators still assigned to the cold case unit, some of them too young to remember the crime when it happened, worked against the grain of time, trying to wring new information from aging files, degraded evidence, and fading memories. One of the most persistent challenges remained the forensic limitations that hampered early investigation efforts. Despite the advent of modern DNA testing, the physical evidence retrieved from the fire-damaged crime scene was scarce and compromised. Investigators had managed to preserve a partial DNA profile that didn't match any of the original suspects, nor anyone in national law enforcement databases. This unknown DNA profile hovered like a specter over every investigative meeting and court hearing, a remnant of a horrific act with no name or face attached. The frustration surrounding this singular piece of evidence deepened with each year it went unmatched. It became a cruel irony. The technology was finally advanced enough to help, but the right sample, the one that could end the suffering, had yet to appear. The legal aftermath continued to unfold slowly and painfully. The original suspects, after years behind bars, had been released and publicly declared innocent of the crime. But their lives, forever altered by the charges and media coverage, had unraveled in ways impossible to repair. The system had failed them just as it had failed the victims. Lawsuits were filed. Accusations were flung at the police department, the prosecution team, and even the media for their role in shaping public opinion prematurely. The story was no longer simply about who committed the crime. It was about how the mechanisms of justice had misfired, dragging innocent people into the wreckage of a flawed investigation. While the city of Austin tried to move on, there were efforts to ensure the case didn't fade entirely into the background. Annual memorials were held, sometimes attended by city officials, sometimes only by the families and a few community members who had refused to forget. The names of the 4 teenage victims, Amy Ayers, Sarah Harbison, Jennifer Harbison, and Eliza Thomas, were inscribed not just in cold case logs, but in the collective memory of a city that had seen its innocence stolen in one terrifying night. Educational scholarships were created in their names, aiming to preserve their legacies beyond the tragedy that had come to define them. For the families, it was a bittersweet gesture, symbolic, heartfelt, but never enough. Outside of official channels, independent researchers and amateur investigators continued their own parallel efforts to uncover the truth. Online forums, blogs, podcasts, and social media communities dissected every known fact about the case. Maps of the crime scene, transcripts from the trial, timelines of witness accounts, and theories both plausible and bizarre were circulated among true crime enthusiasts. In some instances, these independent inquiries unearthed overlooked connections or prompted new leads, which were then passed on to the authorities. However, this form of citizen-led investigation also had a downside. It often led to misinformation being amplified and unproven accusations going viral, which in turn affected innocent lives. For every moment of clarity these efforts offered, there was an equal risk of muddying the truth further. Back in the law enforcement world, investigators continued to hope for the one break that could shatter the silence. They explored newer forensic strategies, including familial DNA testing and phenotyping, which uses genetic data to predict the appearance of the suspect. Some agencies have begun to experiment with this controversial method, producing composite sketches based on DNA evidence, which were then distributed quietly in internal law enforcement circles. Still, there were limitations. DNA-based facial predictions were not exact, and without a match in a known database, they could only guide the investigation, not solve it. The broader criminal justice community watched the case closely. It had become a teaching moment in countless police academies and law schools, referenced in discussions about interrogation ethics, forensic reliability, and media influence. The yogurt shop murders had taken on a symbolic weight, an enduring lesson in the dangers of tunnel vision, the flaws of overconfidence, and the critical importance of safeguarding every piece of evidence, no matter how small. For younger generations of professionals, the case was often introduced not just as a mystery to solve, but as a warning of what could go wrong when procedure falters under pressure. And while the official narrative had unraveled, one truth remained intact. For lives were taken in the most brutal, senseless way imaginable. No amount of forensic advancements, media coverage, or academic debate could erase that. The echo of what happened that night still lingered in Austin, within the families who mourned, the officers who regretted, the suspects who suffered, and the public who remembered. The city had grown, changed, and modernized in the decades since, but the names of the victims still lingered like quiet prayers, unanswered, unforgotten, and still demanding justice that had yet to arrive. As the yogurt shop murder case continued into its 3rd decade without resolution, a somber realization settled over all who had followed it closely. The passage of time had not brought justice, only distance. Investigators, journalists, and families had all clung to the belief that answers would eventually surface. But but each year made that hope feel more fragile. With the original suspects exonerated and no new arrests, the weight of the case now rested on aging evidence, fading recollections, and evolving technologies that still hadn't delivered a match. What once felt like a solvable crime had become a symbol of how even the most horrific cases can become buried beneath legal missteps, procedural misjudgments, and the limitations of the system meant to uphold truth. The Austin Police Department, still carrying the burden of the failed investigation, had made several internal changes over the years. New protocols for evidence preservation, updated interrogation guidelines, and increased transparency in cold case reviews were introduced, in part to avoid repeating the missteps of a yogurt shop case. While these reforms were welcomed, they did little to restore the trust that had been eroded. For many, the stain left by the mishandling of the original investigation would never fully fade. The public had learned a hard truth, that even with the best intentions, justice could be derailed by human error, institutional pressure, and a desperate need for closure. The lack of resolution also affected how cold cases across the country were perceived and prioritized. The yogurt shop case had garnered national attention, prompting comparisons to other infamous unsolved crimes. It became a benchmark for investigative failure, one referenced in textbooks, legal seminars, and forensic workshops. Professionals in the field debated what should have been done differently, not only in terms of evidence collection, but also in managing public expectations and ensuring ethical standards in interrogations. The case served as a grim reminder that solving violent crimes wasn't just about collecting facts. It was about interpreting them with integrity and caution. Public frustration remained high, particularly as advancements in forensic science continued to solve other long cold cases from the same era. Breakthroughs in genetic genealogy had led to the identification of suspects in decades-old crimes, sometimes with minimal evidence to start with. But despite multiple efforts to use similar techniques in the yogurt shop case, the elusive DNA profile yielded no results. Attempts to identify relatives through familial matching also failed to provide any clear direction. The suspect's DNA appeared to belong to someone who had never interacted with the criminal justice system in a way that left a genetic trail, a deeply unsettling notion, given the horrific nature of the crime. For the families of the victims, the emotional toll grew heavier with each passing year. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays became milestones of grief rather than celebration. The initial shock of the loss had long since given way to a quieter, more enduring sorrow, one that gnawed away at the edges of hope. Some parents had passed away without ever learning who was responsible. Others lived on, refusing to let their daughters' names vanish into statistics. They continued to advocate for the case, to remain active, pressing law enforcement, writing to officials, and appearing in public forums to remind the world that their children were more than victims. They were lives unjustly stolen. In the background, cultural shifts also influenced how such cases were discussed and understood. The rise of true crime media, podcasts, documentaries, YouTube channels, and streaming specials brought renewed attention to the yogurt shop murders, often reviving interest from people too young to remember the original crime. These platforms re-examined the timeline, challenged official narratives, and gave voice to alternative theories. While some of these efforts were grounded in fact and research, others veered into sensationalism, offering more confusion than clarity. The sheer volume of content, while keeping the case in the public eye, also made it difficult to separate verified information from speculation. Despite the noise, some good emerged. Renewed media attention brought in fresh tips, and a new generation of digital sleuths contributed time and energy to combing through publicly available documents. Databases were cross-referenced, maps were recreated, and timelines were reconstructed in meticulous detail. These crowdsourced efforts occasionally offered new angles for investigators to consider, though no tip had yet cracked the case. Law enforcement maintained a careful relationship with the public contributors, acknowledging their dedication while cautioning against interference or the spread of misinformation. In private corners of the investigation, there remained belief, however cautious. that the key to solving the case still existed, buried beneath years of confusion. Detectives theorized that the perpetrator might be deceased, living under a false identity, or incarcerated under a different name for unrelated crimes. There was also the growing concern that some critical piece of evidence, perhaps overlooked or misinterpreted early on, had the potential to unlock the mystery if only examined through a different lens. Yet with each year, the odds diminished. Witnesses aged, files deteriorated, memories became shadows of what they once were. And so, the yogurt shop murders continue to occupy a unique and painful space in the American true crime narrative, neither fully cold nor actively solvable. The victims remained central, their names recited in every article, every memorial, every report. Their stories, forever tied together by an act of unimaginable cruelty, had transcended the limitations of time and fact. They became symbols of innocence lost, of justice deferred, and of a collective failure to protect those most vulnerable. As the case endured, it carried with it not just the echo of tragedy, but the lingering, unanswered question that haunted everyone touched by it. How could such a brutal crime remain unsolved for so long? In the 10th chapter of the long and haunting saga that is the yogurt shop murders, the focus deepened on the glaring gaps that remained, not just in the evidence, but in the structure of the justice system itself. Decades had passed, and still the case had no definitive resolution. With each layer unraveled, the investigation exposed more about the fragile architecture of criminal justice than about the crime itself. The case had been mishandled from the start, and though the city of Austin had moved forward, the unhealed wound remained for the families and those who had tried to bring truth to the surface. At the heart of the stalled investigation remained the unidentified male DNA. This trace was the most promising lead and simultaneously the most frustrating obstacle. Despite repeated testing, new forensic tools, and a relentless series of database comparisons, the DNA had not led to a single actionable identity. It didn't match the 4 teens originally accused, nor did it match anyone who had ever been arrested or convicted of a violent crime in the United States. And with no family match available in genealogical databases, the sample remained a cipher, a whisper from the past, impossible to interpret. Technological advancements had allowed DNA from other cold cases to be linked to perpetrators through distant relatives, but the yogurt shop case remained curiously resistant. Even 3rd and 4th degree relative searches yielded nothing. Some theorized the suspect might be from outside the U.S., or that the person had died shortly after the crime, never entering any criminal or civil system that would require a DNA sample. Others feared the sample could be a red herring, possibly contaminated or introduced by someone unconnected to the crime. That ambiguity made it hard to tell whether the DNA was the key or another dead end. Investigators continued their quiet, methodical work behind the scenes, sifting through thousands of pages of case files, revisiting evidence logs, and rechecking forensic reports from a time when digital records were scarce and handwritten notes were the norm. Each audit of the case materials brought renewed hope that something might have been missed. Small inconsistencies in original police statements or overlooked details from the crime scene were analyzed once more, but rarely did these re-examinations yield new momentum. The gaps were often too wide. Crucial hours of the original investigation had been lost to chaos, and some records had been degraded or incomplete. Meanwhile, the psychological aftermath of the case continued to be felt by those indirectly involved. Former detectives, prosecutors, and even journalists who had covered the murders spoke years later about the emotional burden the case left on them. Many described a sense of guilt, either for trusting the wrong evidence, for not asking harder questions, or for reporting details that later turned out to be wrong. It had become a case that haunted careers, a failure that lingered long after the headlines faded. Law enforcement officials retired with the case still unresolved, some admitting they never stopped thinking about the victims or the night that changed the trajectory of so many lives. The cultural imprint of the yogurt shop murders also grew over time. In Austin, It became a somber chapter in the city's history, one often revisited but never concluded. New generations of residents heard the story and were shocked that something so violent and unresolved had happened in a place now known for its vibrancy and safety. True crime documentaries, news specials, and podcasts resurfaced the narrative periodically, always ending on the same note of unresolved grief. The victims' families, while grateful that their daughters were not forgotten, were also repeatedly pulled back into the cycle of retelling and mourning. With every new media wave, the pain resurfaced, but so did the pressure on authorities to keep the case open and active. Legal debates surrounding the case continued in academic and professional circles. The yogurt shop murders were frequently used in law school discussions about wrongful convictions, coerced confessions, and prosecutorial conduct. The question of how two teenagers ended up falsely confessing to such a brutal crime became central to broader conversations about youth vulnerability, interrogation practices, and the legal system's appetite for quick closure over slow, painstaking truth. The case served as a chilling example of how confessions, often seen as the gold standard in courtrooms, could be shaped and manipulated under pressure. Civil rights advocates pushed for deeper investigations into how the original suspects were treated and how their lives had been affected even after being exonerated. While they had been released from prison, the stigma followed them. Finding work, rebuilding relationships, and returning to a semblance of normalcy was not easy for those whose names had once been synonymous with one of the most disturbing crimes in Texas history. The judicial system had taken away years of their lives, and the apology, though public, could never return what had been lost. As each anniversary passed, memorials were held in parks and quiet corners of Austin. Candles were lit. Speeches were given. People who had never met the girls stood in silence, touched by a tragedy that echoed through time. The city had grown, its skyline changed, but the memory of that night in 1991 remained rooted in the collective heart of the community. The absence of justice, the presence of mystery, and the enduring humanity of four lost teenagers ensured that the case, though unsolved, was never forgotten. The unanswered questions still floated in the background of every update, every article, and every hopeful whisper that the truth might one day find its way to the surface. By the 11th chapter of the investigation's long and tragic history, the yogurt shop murders had cemented their place not only as one of Austin's darkest moments, but as a painful case study in how justice can unravel. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more it evolved beyond a criminal mystery into a cultural and institutional reckoning. What began as a desperate search for the individuals who had committed an unthinkable crime had transformed into an exploration of all the ways that systems can fail, scientifically, procedurally, and emotionally. The forensic deadlock remained the most frustrating element. For all the technological progress that had been made since 1991, the one reliable piece of biological evidence, an unidentified male DNA sample, remained unmatched. Law enforcement had explored every legal avenue, including partial familial matching, public genealogy databases, and even international assistance, but nothing surfaced. For a crime so violent and personal, the idea that the perpetrator had not left a larger footprint seemed increasingly improbable. It fueled speculation that the person responsible had either died, vanished from the grid, or operated under an identity completely detached from any known records. The nature of the crime also raised difficult questions about motive, planning, and the type of individual capable of carrying out such brutality. Theories ranged widely, from a single individual with sadistic tendencies to multiple perpetrators caught in a moment of escalating violence. Psychological profiles have been drafted and redrafted over the years, yet no profile seemed to fully account for the particular mix of cruelty, fire, and carelessness that marked the attack. The arson, in particular, stood out. It suggested a desire not just to escape detection, but to erase evidence, to destroy the bodies, the scene, and perhaps even the identities of the victims. That level of destruction pointed to someone experienced, or at the very least, deeply unafraid of consequences. As criminal profilers weighed in, one detail often returned to the forefront: the likelihood that the killer or killers had known the area well. The yogurt shop was located in a busy retail plaza, not a remote or hidden location. Committing such a vicious crime in a space so exposed carried enormous risk. It led many to believe that the perpetrators either had prior knowledge of the store's closing routines or had been watching the girls that evening, possibly even interacting with them beforehand. Some speculated that the crime might have started as a robbery gone wrong, while others believed it had been premeditated from the beginning, with robbery used merely as a cover. Despite the lack of resolution, the case continued to shape modern investigative practices. Cold case units around the country often reference the yogurt shop murders when discussing evidence preservation, confession protocols, and media management. The case served as a warning about the dangers of tunnel vision and the perils of trying to force a narrative when the facts don't support it. In law enforcement seminars, officers were trained to treat every confession with skepticism until it could be independently corroborated by physical evidence. A lesson that came too late for the original suspects in this case. From a legal standpoint, the wrongful arrests and subsequent trials raised troubling questions about prosecutorial discretion and judicial oversight. Two men had been imprisoned based largely on confessions given under questionable circumstances, and despite the eventual dismissal of charges, the system had left deep scars. Legal scholars often cited the yogurt shop case as a turning point in the national conversation about coerced confessions and false imprisonment. These conversations helped fuel reforms in some states, including the mandatory video recording of all police interrogations, especially when minors or vulnerable individuals are involved. For the broader public, however, the most profound impact of the case was emotional. The story of four innocent girls, some still in high school, being killed while working their evening shift resonated far beyond Austin. It pierced the illusion of everyday safety. It reminded parents that their children were never completely safe, even in seemingly secure environments. And it reminded communities that evil could enter through the most mundane doors: a yogurt shop, a mall, a neighborhood sidewalk, and leave devastation in its wake. Memorial efforts remained steady, although the nature of remembrance had shifted over time. In the first decade, gatherings were large and often covered by media. As years passed, they became more intimate, more focused on quiet reflection than public awareness. The victims' names were etched into scholarship funds, plaques, and small ceremonies attended by those who had promised never to let them be forgotten. These moments offered a fragile comfort to the families, a reminder that even in the absence of justice, their daughters' lives had not been erased. And in the corners of the internet where amateur sleuths traded files and theories, the case refused to die. Users combed through old court transcripts, made connections between obscure facts, and created new timelines in search of overlooked clues. Occasionally, their persistence uncovered minor inconsistencies that were relayed to authorities. Rarely groundbreaking, but always a reminder that people still cared, still searched, still believed the truth was buried somewhere. Yet despite the years, the questions remained the same. Who committed this unspeakable act? How did they vanish so completely? Why did the justice system stumble so tragically along the way? And would there ever be a day when those who loved Amy, Sarah, Jennifer, and Eliza could finally say goodbye with the peace that only justice can bring? Until that day arrived, the case lived on, quietly, painfully, and defiantly unresolved. In the 12th phase of the long-standing investigation, the yogurt shop murders stood as a chilling illustration of what happens when time, memory, and technology struggle to bridge the gap between evidence and justice. As the years stacked upon each other, the sense of urgency had not disappeared, but it had transformed. The feverish intensity that marked the early days of the case had matured into a relentless, methodical kind of persistence. Investigators, journalists, and civilians no longer searched with the same desperate pace. They searched with hardened resolve, understanding the gravity of the silence left behind. The original crime scene had been thoroughly compromised by the nature of the fire and the rush of first responders who had no reason to expect they were stepping into a quadruple homicide. That lack of awareness was understandable in the moment, but became a devastating flaw in retrospect. Many potential traces, footprints, fibers, impressions, had been wiped away or contaminated, and the possibility that critical DNA had been destroyed in the blaze remained one of the case's great, unprovable tragedies. Years later, this would continue to haunt forensic experts who reviewed the case, because it symbolized how one moment of misjudgment can erase justice permanently. A central frustration came from the legal tangle surrounding the confessions of two teenage suspects who were later exonerated. Though their statements were ultimately discredited, their impact on the investigation had already been profound. They had influenced public perception, redirected the focus of police work, and anchored years of effort into what became a false lead. The judicial system had invested too heavily in those confessions, which were extracted under pressure and without the corroborative evidence needed to solidify their claims. The time wasted pursuing the wrong individuals had cost the investigation its most critical years, the earliest ones, when witness memories were fresh and evidence was most intact. This misdirection also poisoned the well for future investigative efforts. Once a case has been built and torn down in court, it becomes increasingly difficult to rebuild it from scratch. Witnesses become reluctant, leads grow cold, and public cooperation wanes. Prosecutors grow cautious, fearing the consequences of another high-profile misstep. The community begins to emotionally disengage, protecting itself from the wounds of renewed false hope. In the yogurt shop murders, that disillusionment spread far beyond the victims' families, touching every branch of the system and shaking the faith of those who had once believed in its infallibility. Behind the scenes, though, a few committed individuals never let the case fall into oblivion. Some detectives quietly revisited the timeline. Others tracked obscure tips, hoping for that one anomaly, that one contradiction that might change everything. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued reanalyzing the remaining physical evidence with tools that didn't exist in the early 90s. But for all the effort, the same result persisted. No conclusive match, no new suspects, no closing chapter. The reality was stark. Solving the yogurt shop murders would likely require either a confession from the actual perpetrator or a rare forensic breakthrough, perhaps driven by a technological leap or a change in how databases were accessed. Investigators had hoped that as more people submitted their DNA to genealogy platforms, the odds of a familial hit would increase. But despite exponential growth in such databases, nothing surfaced that pointed definitively toward the killer. It was a cruel irony that in a time where so many cold cases were finding closure, this one remained untouched by the wave of modern justice. Outside the investigative realm, the case had evolved into a source of fear, fascination, and study. The community, which had once reeled in horror, now held the case as a kind of historical scar, visible but numb. New residents of Austin would learn about the murders not from local news, but from crime documentaries and internet forums. It became something of a cautionary tale for a generation that didn't remember the fear that gripped the city in 1991. What lingered, instead, was the mythos that evil could erupt in the most ordinary places against the most innocent people and then vanish without explanation. For the families, however, myth had no place. They did not dwell in the abstract. Their pain remained intensely personal and deeply present. Each holiday, each anniversary, and each new year marked not only time lost, but a fresh confrontation with absence. They had outlived their daughters, and in doing so, had been forced into roles no parent should bear: public advocates, researchers, speakers, and symbols. Their private grief had long ago become a matter of public record, and still, they endured, hoping for a resolution that had eluded them for over 3 decades. As the case stretched further into the 21st century, it became less about catching a killer and more about preserving the integrity of the memory. The story of Amy, Sarah, Eliza, and Jennifer demanded to be remembered accurately and honorably, not just for the horror they suffered, but for the lives they lived. And that story continued to echo through every unsolved case file. Every press conference, every quiet moment where someone, somewhere, asked the question again. How does someone commit such an act and disappear without a trace? The answer, still, remained locked away, hidden in time, waiting. In the 13th stage of this haunting case's evolution, the yogurt shop murders had grown beyond the confines of a local crime and emerged as a symbol of deep institutional flaws, of broken processes, mishandled evidence, and irreversible mistakes. What made this story persist in the collective memory of a community and the nation at large wasn't just the brutality of the crime. It was the uncomfortable truth that even in the face of overwhelming tragedy, justice had remained elusive, slow, and fragile. By now, it was not just about finding who had done it, but understanding why every attempt to do so had failed. The lingering presence of this case in public discourse owed much to the rising popularity of true crime media. Documentaries, podcasts, and online series had revisited the yogurt shop murders repeatedly, each offering a slightly different lens. Some focused on the missteps of the police investigation, highlighting the reckless reliance on coerced confessions. Others examined the forensic dead ends, zooming in on the unmatched DNA that stubbornly defied classification. Still others tried to humanize the 4 teenage girls, using school photos and family interviews to restore their identities in a story often overwhelmed by procedural failure. These portrayals kept the case alive, ensuring that even as witnesses aged and memories faded, a new generation would encounter the story, and the demand for answers would not fade with time. Among law enforcement circles, the case had become a cautionary tale taught in academy classrooms and forensic training sessions. New officers were taught the importance of chain of custody procedures, the dangers of cognitive bias during interrogations, and the critical need to question evidence, even when it seems to support a theory too conveniently. Instructors used transcripts and video clips from the original interrogations of the exonerated teens to demonstrate how confessions could be shaped, influenced, and even fabricated under duress. These teachings weren't abstract. They were the direct legacy of the mistakes made in Austin decades earlier. Meanwhile, the legal community continued to revisit the implications of what had occurred during the trials. Attorneys pointed to the yogurt shop case as a classic example of prosecutorial overreach. With intense media pressure, political stakes, and grieving families demanding closure, prosecutors had pursued convictions even as key evidence contradicted their narrative. The appellate courts later ruled that the evidence used was not sufficient to uphold the verdicts. But by then, the damage had already been done. Years had been lost. Innocent lives had been disrupted, and the real perpetrator had been allowed more time to remain free, unaccounted for. In forensic science, experts debated the unexplained male DNA left behind. While the sample remained viable and had been retested with newer technologies, it had yet to yield a usable match. The forensic community had come to view the yogurt shop murders as one of the clearest examples of how even the most conclusive biological evidence can become impotent without proper context. The presence of the DNA confirmed a male individual who had been at the crime scene, likely involved. But without a face, a name, or even a reliable sketch, the sample remained little more than a ghost in the database. Frustratingly, multiple false leads continued to plague the investigation over the years. Every so often, a tip would surface, someone claiming they overheard a confession, someone remembering a suspicious stranger, someone sure they had new information. Investigators followed up on these leads diligently, but they always ended the same way: inconclusive or outright false. Some tips came from those seeking attention, others from those genuinely convinced they remembered something important. Each one added another layer of fatigue to a case already buckling under its own weight. The impact on the community remained deep. In Austin, the case was spoken of in hushed tones. Local residents who had lived through the early 90s could vividly recall the fear and disbelief that swept through the city. The murders had destroyed the perception that such violence was a distant threat. It had happened in their backyard to their daughters, in a place that sold frozen yogurt and smiles. That innocence, once lost, had never truly returned. The families of the victims, who had shown unimaginable strength over the years, had grown accustomed to the cycle of renewed hope and fresh disappointment. Every forensic development brought the potential for resolution, but also the dread that this time would be just like the last. The passage of time had made the pain quieter, but no less real. Some family members had passed away without answers. Others had devoted their lives to victim advocacy, turning personal tragedy into public service, hoping to prevent future families from enduring the same nightmare. Public memorials served as moments of pause, reminders that the girls' lives were worth remembering beyond the shadow of their deaths. Schools held scholarship programs in their names. Community centers hosted talks about justice reform inspired by the case. These efforts, while noble, could never substitute for justice, but they offered small pillars of meaning in a sea of unresolved loss. Through all of this, one thing remained constant: the absence of closure. Decades after the flames were extinguished in that yogurt shop, the crime still echoed in the halls of justice, in the minds of the community, and in the heart of every person who ever believed that the truth would eventually prevail. As more years passed, the urgency might fade, but the questions never would. Someone knew the truth. Someone had walked away from that night untouched by law, but not by consequence. And until that person was found, the silence would speak louder than any confession ever could. By the 14th stage in this enduring tragedy, the yogurt shop murders had become more than an unresolved crime. They had transformed into a benchmark for everything that could go wrong in an investigation. It was no longer just about piecing together what happened on that cold December night in 1991, but also about understanding how a case that had captured national attention could remain so frustratingly unfinished despite the best efforts of generations of law enforcement, forensic specialists, legal professionals, and everyday citizens. The passage of time had done little to erase the rawness of the crime itself. 4 young girls, bound, murdered, and left in a blaze that consumed not only their lives, but also vital forensic clues. No motive ever fully justified the brutality. No suspect had ever fit cleanly into the puzzle. Each theory, each piece of evidence, seemed to raise more questions than it answered. And even as technology evolved, offering new tools and methods, the central mystery remained frustratingly intact. The DNA profile continued to loom large over the investigation. It had become the closest thing to a fingerprint left by a ghost. Despite repeated testing, expanding databases, and more advanced analysis, the profile remained unmatched. Each failure to connect the sample to an individual underscored the terrifying possibility that the perpetrator was not only unidentified but untraceable, living a quiet life, blending into society, aging in parallel with the families of the girls whose lives he had taken. The inability to match the DNA to any known offender shook confidence not only in the case, but in the power of modern forensic science itself. More than just a scientific riddle, the case also highlighted the limitations of the justice system. With 2 young men, once convicted and later exonerated, the question of prosecutorial responsibility had become a focal point. Critics argued that tunnel vision and a rush to resolution had resulted in a miscarriage of justice that permanently altered lives while allowing the real killer to remain free. These missteps fueled debates about the ethical obligations of law enforcement and prosecutors in high-pressure cases, particularly when media scrutiny is intense and public outcry demands swift action. The media itself had played an undeniable role in shaping the trajectory of the case. In the early 90s, local and national outlets covered every development, often with sensational headlines and emotionally charged narratives. The intense spotlight amplified mistakes, distorted public perception, and may have influenced the behavior of investigators and prosecutors eager to present progress. Over time, as the story aged and newer tragedies took center stage, the yogurt shop case faded from daily headlines. Yet every anniversary, every false lead, and every documentary brought it back into focus, reawakening interest and disappointment. Meanwhile, online communities had taken up the mantle. Armchair detectives pored over public records, trial transcripts, and decades-old interviews. They created timelines, analyzed crime scene photos, and compared theories. These amateur efforts were often meticulous, sometimes far-fetched, but always driven by a sincere desire for truth. In a few instances, their efforts even prompted authorities to re-examine details that had been overlooked or dismissed. Though these digital detectives lacked badges or formal authority, they symbolized a broader truth. People still cared. People still wanted justice. In the legal world, the yogurt shop murders also influenced broader reforms. The case contributed to ongoing national discussions about interrogation practices, especially involving young or vulnerable suspects. There was growing support for mandatory video recordings of all interrogations, stronger oversight of confession validity, and more rigorous standards for physical evidence linking suspect to crimes. These measures, while not retroactive, were seen as crucial steps to prevent future miscarriages of justice like those experienced early in the investigation. For the city of Austin, the legacy of the case lived on in a different way. What had once been a local trauma had become a permanent chapter in the city's history. Residents who had been children or teenagers in 1991 now taught their own children about what happened. The site of the yogurt shop had been rebuilt long ago, but the memories attached to that address lingered in the community consciousness. Each passing year etched the story deeper into Austin's cultural memory, a tragic reminder of innocence lost and justice deferred. The emotional toll on the families was immeasurable. After decades of waiting, hoping, and grieving, many had come to terms with the possibility that closure might never come. Some had shifted their energy toward advocacy, channeling their pain into legislative work, victim rights efforts, or community education. Others had withdrawn from the public eye, finding that constant reminders only prolonged the wound. But no matter how they coped, the impact of that night and the years that followed would remain a defining part of their lives. Ultimately, the yogurt shop murders had become an open wound in the fabric of American true crime history. It exposed how justice can be delayed, how the truth can be buried under decades of failed leads and corrupted processes, and how the human need for answers doesn't diminish with time. In the absence of resolution, there was only the hope that one day, through science, confession, or chance, the full truth would finally be known. Until then, the case would endure as a mystery, a lesson, and a quiet cry for justice that echoed across generations. As the 15th chapter of this relentless case unfolded, the yogurt shop murders had taken on an unsettling duality. They existed both as a real, raw tragedy etched into the lives of 4 grieving families, and as an emblem of institutional failure studied in classrooms, debated in legal circles, and dissected in online forums. The contrast was sharp. Behind the theoretical conversations about justice reform and forensic advancement were the unchanging facts of 4 young lives stolen and a city left haunted by the echo of a crime that never found its rightful conclusion. The progression of time only deepened the complexity. It wasn't simply a matter of distance from the original event. It was the accumulated weight of missteps, abandoned leads, failed prosecutions, and cold trails. Every year added new layers of documentation, theories, and dead ends. Files grew thicker. Case summaries became more intricate. The story became harder to tell simply because it had no clear end, no linear trajectory, and no closure. And in that complexity, something else quietly took root. A national discomfort with the idea that sometimes, even in a modern, justice-driven society, evil can go unpunished. The unmatched male DNA remained a particularly painful reminder of that truth. It was the closest thing to a piece of the killer still lingering at the scene, locked in a lab report but lacking a name or face. It had withstood years of retesting, analysis through evolving DNA technology, and constant comparison to growing databases. Yet despite all the tools at the disposal of modern forensics, the profile yielded nothing conclusive. Investigators were left staring at a marker of presence, not identity. a ghost made of biological certainty, but invisible to every tracking system designed to catch those who leave such traces behind. Over the years, there had been quiet speculation that the killer might have died, or might be incarcerated under an alias, or even might live in obscurity, never arrested, never flagged, never entered into the systems that could generate a match. These possibilities weren't just troubling, they were infuriating, because they reinforced a chilling idea that justice is not inevitable, that some individuals can commit horrifying acts and, by some combination of circumstance and luck, escape accountability entirely. It was a sobering counterpoint to the belief that time, science, and perseverance always win. At the heart of this frustration remained the families. Their grief was no longer fresh, but it was unhealed. They had outlived their daughters by decades. They had endured not only the brutality of the crime itself, but also the secondary pain inflicted by flawed investigations, media speculation, courtroom failures, and public scrutiny. In moments of quiet, some of them admitted the hardest part wasn't even the lack of answers. It was the knowledge that so much of the suffering that followed might have been avoidable. That if certain protocols had been followed, if evidence had been preserved properly, if suspects had been vetted more rigorously, the story might have played out differently. They had become reluctant experts in legal procedure, forensic science, and criminal psychology, not by choice, but by necessity. They had watched the names of their daughters become case numbers, exhibits, and headlines. And still, they had shown up to every hearing, answered every call from investigators, and spoken at every anniversary vigil. Their presence remained the last constant in a case where everything else had shifted. For those working on the case in its current iteration, the burden was equally heavy. Cold case units tasked with re-examining the evidence carried not only the professional responsibility of reopening the files, but also the emotional responsibility of facing decades of institutional failure. Each new detective, prosecutor, or forensic analyst brought with them the hope of a fresh perspective, but also inherited the ghosts of every error made before. They knew that their work would be scrutinized not only by the families, but by a public deeply familiar with the case and impatient for progress. Efforts to crowdsource new leads have become more refined, though still cautious. Advances in investigative genealogy offered a glimmer of hope, particularly if even a partial match to a relative of the unknown DNA donor could be found. But such approaches required resources, permission, and often the cooperation of third-party platforms. The process was slow, with no guaranteed reward. Yet for a case this old and this iconic, even the faintest possibilities were pursued. Meanwhile, the community of Austin, vastly changed since 1991, still carried the emotional residue of the crime. Murals, plaques, and quiet dedications stood in place of the original yogurt shop, marking the space not with sensationalism, but with remembrance. Residents who had been children when the murders occurred now raised their own families in the same neighborhoods, telling the story with a mixture of fear and reverence. It served as a reminder that beneath the city's growth and progress was a story still unresolved, a chapter still open. In this long and winding journey, the yogurt shop murders had become a solemn pledge to those who believe justice is not defined by speed, but by persistence. It was a vow that as long as the case remained unsolved, it would never be forgotten. For the 4 girls who never made it home that night, their names would continue to be spoken, and their story, painful, unfinished, and still burning beneath the surface, would not be silenced until the truth emerged from the shadows. By the 16th stage of this unrelenting case, the yogurt shop murders had solidified their place not only as one of Austin's most tragic crimes, but also as one of America's most frustrating examples of unresolved justice. Time had become both an enemy and an ally, eroding memories and complicating the investigation, yet also offering advancements in forensic science, fresh perspectives, and moments of renewed hope. But with every passing year, the pressure mounted. It was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about reclaiming faith in a system that had stumbled when it mattered most. The core of that failure was always the original investigation. From the first responders who walked into a scorched crime scene, to the early interrogations that later unraveled under legal scrutiny, the foundation of the case had been cracked from the beginning. Evidence was mishandled. Leads were rushed or abandoned. Suspects were coerced. And critical biological traces, like the male DNA, had been preserved but not understood. These early missteps created a ripple effect that investigators decades later would still be trying to correct, piece by piece, with limited tools and fading clarity. One of the biggest frustrations remained the timeline. The precise sequence of events inside the yogurt shop that night was still not fully known. Investigators had reconstructed much of it based on forensic indicators and the positions of the victims' bodies, but a full narrative had never materialized. Who entered first? Were there multiple perpetrators? Did the victims know any of them? Was it a random act of violence or something premeditated? Each theory raised its own set of conflicting conclusions, none of which could be definitively proven. And in that uncertainty lay the most agonizing truth. Without a clear understanding of what exactly happened, finding out who did it became exponentially harder. Despite multiple arrests, trials, and even partial convictions, the case had essentially reset. Those once charged with the crime had been released, their convictions overturned due to lack of credible evidence and issues with their confessions. And though law enforcement never officially declared them innocent, the courts had made clear that what had been used against them was insufficient and possibly coercive. The reversal of those convictions had not just freed individuals. It had reopened every painful wound for the victims' families, forcing them to relive the trauma without the closure they thought was finally near. The male DNA found at the scene remained the strongest piece of untainted evidence. And yet, after being tested against databases in all 50 states and even internationally, no match had emerged. This unsolved profile had become a symbol of both hope and despair. Hope, because it was tangible, proof that the killer had left something behind. Despair, because despite all advancements in DNA forensics, the man it belonged to remained hidden. He could be anywhere. He could be living under a different name. He could even be dead. And unless some new event brought his identity to light, the profile would continue to sit in its database, a ghost waiting for recognition. The frustrating nature of the case had also begun to inspire a new kind of dialogue in criminal justice and forensic psychology circles. Experts debated the long-term psychological impact of unresolved crimes, not just on the families, but on the communities and professionals tied to them. Cold case detectives assigned to long unsolved murders like this one often described emotional fatigue, the sense of chasing a shadow that always seemed one step ahead. Prosecutors struggled with the ethics of pursuing charges without absolute certainty. And public defenders cited the yogurt shop case as a chilling example of how easily innocent people could be caught in the gears of a flawed system. Still, there was a persistence in Austin that never faded. Cold case units quietly returned to the evidence again and again. Legal advocates kept the case on the radar of state officials. Family members remained outspoken, not to reopen old wounds, but to ensure that their daughters were never reduced to statistics. And while the public's attention had shifted toward other stories over the years, the yogurt shop murders remained a grim landmark for anyone familiar with Texas criminal history. Documentaries and investigative podcasts had done their part in keeping interest alive, too. Each production, whether local, national, or international, brought a new audience to the case. While some focused on the failures of the system, others shined light on the victims' lives and the impact their deaths had on their loved ones. These narratives helped reshape the conversation, turning the focus away from just the gruesome details and placing it on the people at the heart of the tragedy. Even with so many unanswered questions, one fact remained constant. The case was not forgotten. It lingered in the collective conscience as both a call for justice and a reminder of how fragile justice can be. In a society that often moves quickly from one headline to the next, the yogurt shop murders had endured, etched into the fabric of a city, and kept alive by those who refused to let silence win. It was no longer just a story of 4 girls lost. It was a story of perseverance, of a community unwilling to close the book until the final chapter was written. And as long as that chapter remained unwritten, there would always be people asking, searching, and hoping, believing that even after decades, the truth still mattered. By the 17th chapter in the saga of the yogurt shop murders, the case had evolved into a haunting symbol of cold case persistence, an intricate web of forensic puzzles, public frustration, and legal uncertainty. While many other cases from the early 1990s had long since been resolved or forgotten, this one continued to demand attention, not because of new suspects or dramatic developments, but because of the painful absence of any definitive answers. It was a crime whose gravity never faded, whose brutality never dulled, and whose impact only grew heavier with the weight of time. The psychological toll of this case reached far beyond the immediate circle of the victims' families. In law enforcement, generations of officers had come and gone, yet each new detective assigned to the case was drawn into its complexity. They entered with hope, aware of the scrutiny and the legacy, but often found themselves tangled in the same problems that had confounded their predecessors. Inconsistencies in early reports, gaps in forensic continuity, missing or damaged physical evidence, and conflicting testimonies that had become increasingly unreliable over the decades. One of the critical roadblocks remained the fragmented nature of the evidence. Much of what was collected in 1991 had either degraded due to fire damage or been contaminated due to the lack of strict evidence handling protocols at the time. The fire that had consumed the yogurt shop had also consumed potential clues, perhaps a partial fingerprint, a dropped item, or a weapon. Whatever was lost in those flames could have changed the trajectory of the case. And what little remained was often insufficient to form a cohesive narrative or to directly tie a suspect to the scene beyond circumstantial speculation. The unmatched DNA profile stood as the last pillar of hope. While other evidence had weakened with time, this genetic trace had remained intact and valid. It had been tested using increasingly advanced methods over the years, including familial DNA, searching, and predictive phenotyping. Investigators had even explored investigative genetic genealogy, using public DNA databases to trace familial lines of unknown suspects. But privacy laws and limitations on third-party cooperation had complicated those efforts. The reality was harsh. Even the most advanced technology meant nothing without a match. Public pressure continued to build. Though interest in true crime had exploded through podcasts, documentaries, and online forums, the yogurt shop murders carried a weight that separated it from other unsolved stories. It wasn't just morbid curiosity. It was a sense of shared failure. The community of Austin had mourned these girls as their own. Each passing year without justice didn't bring closure. It reawakened outrage. Candlelight vigils, anniversary memorials, and occasional media specials kept the case in public consciousness. And while those moments of attention provided opportunities to generate new tips or leads, they also served as bitter reminders of the long-standing void. The city itself had changed beyond recognition. The once quiet North Austin neighborhood that housed the yogurt shop had grown and modernized, with new storefronts and residential developments replacing the original landscape. Yet for longtime residents, the memory of the fire and the aftermath remained crystal clear. Many still remembered hearing the sirens that night, reading the headlines the next morning, and feeling the chill that something irreversibly evil had passed through their city. Even those who were too young to recall the event directly grew up hearing about it, cautioned by parents, warned in school, reminded by the media. The case became part of the city's modern folklore, shaping how people talked about crime, justice, and fear. Meanwhile, legal experts had begun to use the yogurt shop case in academic discussions about wrongful convictions and prosecutorial accountability. The original arrests, confessions, and overturned convictions have become a case study in what happens when urgency overtakes due process. Interrogations conducted without proper safeguards, leading questions, and psychological pressure were highlighted as factors that had derailed the investigation rather than advancing it. These analyses didn't just look backward. They influenced how new cases were handled nationwide. In that way, the yogurt shop murders had left a lasting imprint, even in the absence of a resolution. For the families, however, these academic and procedural discussions brought little comfort. Their reality was frozen in 1991. Birthdays that never came. Graduations that never happened. Lives imagined then lost. Their grief was made even more complicated by the system's failings. Years spent pursuing justice through the courts, only to see verdicts reversed or evidence discredited. The absence of accountability cast a long shadow over their mourning. And while some family members had stepped into advocacy roles or given public interviews, others chose silence. Not out of resignation, but because no words could accurately express the ongoing pain of not knowing. Yet amidst all this, hope still flickered. Investigators held on to the belief that someone, somewhere, might yet step forward. That someone involved, or who had been told something by someone involved, would one day decide to break their silence. After all, the crime had never been the work of a mastermind. It was chaotic, desperate, and cruel. Those responsible might have spoken to friends or family, or left behind hints they believed insignificant. And all it would take was one person willing to come forward, one truth finally spoken aloud, to begin the process of long overdue justice. Until that happened, the yogurt shop murders would remain suspended in a state of tragic incompletion. A brutal crime without a known perpetrator. A case that had been closed, reopened, retried, and re-examined more times than most. And yet, it endured, not just as a puzzle to be solved, but as a symbol of the resilience of memory, the power of truth, and the painful consequences of justice delayed. By the 18th stage of the yogurt shop murders case, it had become painfully evident that the search for justice had outlasted generations of investigators, outpaced technological breakthroughs, and deeply tested the resolve of everyone involved. What began as a horrifying local tragedy had stretched into a national emblem of unresolved pain, procedural error, and institutional frustration. With every new year that passed without resolution, the case seemed to morph into something larger than the crime itself. A cautionary tale about the fragility of justice when urgency collides with uncertainty. At the heart of the case, even decades later, were the 4 teenage girls who never returned home. Their names had become familiar to the public, not just through news cycles, but through a slow accumulation of grief-driven remembrance on anniversary vigils, in tribute documentaries, and across online communities that refused to let the story fade. Yet despite the visibility of their tragedy, what happened to them remained obscured by a maze of unanswered questions. Their final moments were still a matter of theory, their assailants still anonymous, and their families still stuck in a loop of sorrow with no conclusion. Investigators were not idle. The passage of time had changed the tools at their disposal, if not the facts of the case. Crime scene analysis had become more precise, and DNA technology had evolved significantly. Yet despite the unmatched male DNA profile being retested against ever-growing federal and international databases, it had failed to yield name. Law enforcement's hope rested increasingly on the promise of genealogical breakthroughs, the same methods that had solved cases once thought unsolvable, like the Golden State Killer. But such efforts took time, resources, and often the cooperation of private genetic databases whose privacy policies posed hurdles in high-profile criminal cases. This reliance on emerging technology created a paradox. On one hand, there was unprecedented optimism that a match might someday be found through a distant relative or obscure familial line. On the other, it exposed a helplessness that despite decades of investigative effort, the only way forward might hinge on algorithms, third-party databases, and the randomness of who had or hadn't submitted their DNA to an ancestry service. It was a sharp reminder that sometimes justice depended less on detective work and more on luck. Meanwhile, the local impact of the case continued to echo throughout Austin. While the city had grown exponentially since 1991, expanding into a modern urban hub, it hadn't forgotten its darkest crime. The space where the yogurt shop once stood had long since been redeveloped, but the memory of what happened there couldn't be erased by concrete or time. Conversations about the case would still arise in classrooms, in town hall meetings, and among new officers being trained on how to handle high-stakes investigations with greater care and diligence than those who came before them. The educational impact of the yogurt shop murders extended far beyond the police academy. Legal seminars, forensic science programs, and criminal justice courses all used the case as a teaching tool. It was a real-world example of how quickly an investigation could go awry under pressure. False confessions, tainted evidence, public outcry, and premature conclusions. Each was dissected and analyzed. It had become a lesson in how not to conduct a criminal investigation and a sobering case study of what happens when the justice system fails to self-correct in time. This institutional reflection, though valuable, did little to ease the anguish of the families. To them, the focus was always clear, for girls had been murdered, and no one had ever truly answered for it. Each year brought more distance from the truth. Memories faded. Witnesses grew older. Some passed away. The chance to question someone who might have seen something or known something slipped further away with each lost opportunity. The case was alive, but only just sustained by a fragile thread of hope, stretched thin by time and silence. Among the more recent efforts was a renewed push from cold case advocates to elevate public awareness in a more strategic way, rather than relying solely on local media or memorial events. Some proposed targeted campaigns using social media and forensic databases to crowdsource tips or find distant relatives of the DNA suspect. These campaigns weren't just about exposure. They were designed to make use of collective intelligence to reach audiences that traditional media couldn't. It was a digital age strategy for a crime committed in an analog era. Still, even the most promising tools couldn't guarantee results. What they could offer, however, was a sense that the case hadn't been abandoned, that someone, somewhere was still trying, that the names of those girls still mattered, that this wasn't just a story told in past tense, but a living investigation with potential for resolution, however remote it might seem. The hardest truth to swallow was that there was no new villain to focus on, no fresh suspect, no dramatic twist, no revelation that rewrote everything. What remained was absence. Absence of justice, absence of closure, absence of accountability. And in that absence, the story of the yogurt shop murders lived on, not through resolution, but through the relentless insistence of those who refused to forget. Those who believed, stubbornly and painfully, that even the coldest case could still one day thaw. By the time the case had reached its 19th stage, the yogurt shop murders stood as more than a horrifying moment in time. They had become a benchmark for institutional learning, media scrutiny, and the moral weight of unsolved crimes. Even as other notorious cases had faded into the background of public memory, this one held its ground. It wasn't because of a constant flow of new information. There rarely was any, but because of the way this case had become embedded in the collective conscience of a city, a state, and a nation that couldn't reconcile such horror with such a lack of answers. One of the most glaring challenges was the lack of a central narrative. Unlike many cases where motive, timeline, and perpetrator behavior gradually came into focus, this crime remained frustratingly ambiguous. Despite years of investigation, a clear, evidence-supported explanation of what happened inside the shop that night still didn't exist. Theories varied. Some suggested a botched robbery that turned brutal. Others pointed toward premeditation and personal targeting. A few proposed random, thrill-seeking violence. Each hypothesis had supporters, and each had weaknesses that left investigators unable to fully commit. The unresolved nature of the crime scene itself further fueled confusion. The level of fire damage, the layout of the bodies, and the lack of a singular murder weapon made it hard to reconstruct the sequence of events with certainty. Forensic evidence had been either destroyed or degraded. Blood patterns, accelerant traces, and bullet trajectories had been partially obscured or altered by the heat and flames. Even today's most advanced crime scene analysts would struggle to make definitive conclusions based on such compromised data. And in a case this old, there was no chance to revisit the site in any meaningful forensic way. It had long since been altered, rebuilt, and repurposed. Public opinion around the case had also evolved. While early years were dominated by media-driven speculation and support for swift justice, often centered around the original suspects, Later years saw a shift toward caution, doubt, and a demand for transparency. Many now questioned whether the urgency to solve the crime in the early 90s had compromised the possibility of true justice. The reliance on confessions later deemed unreliable, the circumstantial connections, the lack of physical evidence linking any suspect to the murders, all of it had contributed to a widespread reevaluation of how the case had been handled. Legal experts continued to dissect those early missteps, particularly the interrogations that led to the initial arrests. The confessions, obtained after hours of intense questioning without legal counsel present, became focal points in academic and judicial conversations about coercion and wrongful convictions. Though courts had ultimately overturned the convictions, they left behind a lingering doubt, not just about the guilt of the original suspects, but about the competency of the system designed to uncover the truth. This ongoing legal debate had another effect. It made potential new prosecutions even more difficult. Prosecutors now faced the added burden of history. Any new charges would be heavily scrutinized by defense attorneys, judges, the media, and the public. The precedent of the past would loom over every decision. And with little new physical evidence emerging, the case would likely have to hinge on circumstantial factors or breakthroughs in DNA identification, neither of which had delivered thus far. The families of the victims, caught in the middle of this decades-long storm, had taken different paths in how they processed the years of loss and uncertainty. Some had remained highly vocal, engaging with the media and law enforcement in the hope that renewed visibility might spark progress. Others had withdrawn, choosing to grieve privately and avoid the often painful attention the case continued to attract. Yet regardless of their approach, all of them lived with the same brutal reality, that the person or people who had taken their daughters' lives had never faced consequences. Community efforts to keep the memory of the victims alive became increasingly vital. Local schools, neighborhood groups, and advocacy organizations often held memorial events not just to honor the girls, but to educate future generations about the importance of justice and the dangers of complacency. These events were not only acts of remembrance, but subtle forms of activism, ensuring that the city never fully moved on from a crime that had once defined its darkest hour. Even within law enforcement, there was a quiet acknowledgement that this case was different. It wasn't just another cold case file. It was a responsibility passed down through generations of detectives, each inheriting not just the facts, but the emotional burden of a case that refused to go silent. Younger officers learned about it during their training. Senior investigators referenced it during strategic briefings. It was, in many ways, the haunting centerpiece of the Austin Police Department's unsolved crimes list. The digital age brought new possibilities as amateur sleuths and online communities dedicated entire forums to dissecting every element of the case. Tips occasionally emerged from these discussions, though none had led to significant breakthroughs. Still, the existence of these digital spaces demonstrated a powerful truth: people still cared. The fire of public interest had not been extinguished. It had simply changed shape, adapting to new platforms and methods of expression. Yet for all the discussion, dedication, and forensic advancements, the case remained frozen. Justice remained elusive. The girls' names remained etched in memory, but their story had yet to be completed. The yogurt shop murders were no longer just an investigation. They were a wound that had never fully healed, a test that the justice system had yet to pass, and a quiet but persistent reminder that some crimes leave echoes that never fade. By the 20th section of the yogurt shop murders case, the emotional weight of decades without resolution had transformed the tragedy into something more than an unsolved crime. It had become a reflection of every systemic failure embedded in the American criminal justice process. From its very beginning, this case was marred by urgency and pressure, driven by public outrage and fear. But what lingered now was exhaustion, not just in the families of the victims, but in the investigators, legal experts, and the broader community that had followed this story for over 30 years. There was no ignoring the psychological toll this case had taken. Many officers who had once worked the investigation had since retired, carrying with them the frustration of unanswered questions and the stigma of a case that eluded closure. Others who had grown up with the story, aspiring to be the ones who might finally bring it to an end, found themselves face to face with the same fragmented files, the same contradictory reports, and the same unyielding silence from those who might still know the truth. The idea that justice would eventually prevail had begun to feel like a distant hope, rather than a realistic goal. The legal complexities added yet another layer of stagnation. The initial prosecutions, tainted by questionable interrogation techniques and lacking physical evidence, had left the judicial system hesitant to move forward without a bulletproof case. The scrutiny brought on by prior wrongful convictions had paralyzed further efforts. Any potential new arrest would need overwhelming evidence, concrete, forensic, undeniable proof. But the nature of the crime, the destruction caused by the fire, and the decades of degradation had left little to work with. Investigators found themselves locked in a paradox, unable to ignore the case, yet unable to conclusively move it forward. Still, the DNA profile remained at the center of everything. It was the one piece of evidence that held promise, even after all these years. An unidentified male profile recovered from the crime scene had been tested against databases across the country. Despite thousands of comparisons and new entries each year, it still had not returned a match. Genetic genealogy, hailed as the next frontier in cold case resolution, had provided promising leads in other high-profile cases, but in this one, the suspect's genetic footprint remained isolated, unconnected to any known relatives in public or law enforcement databases. Efforts were made to encourage people to submit their DNA voluntarily. Awareness campaigns, true crime podcasts, and even billboards briefly appeared with reminders of the unsolved case, suggesting that anyone with even a vague memory of that night, anyone who suspected someone in their life, should speak up. But after so much time, witnesses had died, memories had faded, and the likelihood of new information emerging through traditional channels had diminished. The silence was deafening, and that silence, more than anything else, had become the true enemy of justice. Amid this void, the community's role remained essential. In Austin, remembrance events took place regularly. These weren't just gestures, they were demands. They signaled that the story wasn't forgotten, that the 4 young lives lost weren't reduced to case numbers or old headlines. Their photographs were displayed, candles were lit, and words were spoken in their memory. The family's pain was kept visible, and that visibility, while painful, helped maintain the pressure on those still working the case to never let it fall into obscurity. Nationally, the yogurt shop murders continue to be studied. Legal scholars examined the flawed interrogation techniques that led to the original confessions made without corroborating evidence, some of which had been recanted. Investigative journalists published retrospectives, documentaries were produced, and podcast episodes dissected every known detail. These efforts reignited interest and sometimes generated new tips, but rarely did they lead to anything actionable. The cycle repeated. Interest would rise, leads would be chased, and eventually they would fade, returning the case to its familiar limbo. What remained most frustrating was the general consensus among those close to the investigation that someone out there still knew something. Whether it was a direct participant, an accomplice, or simply someone who had heard a confession over the years, the sense lingered that the truth hadn't vanished. It had just been buried beneath fear, shame, or misplaced loyalty. That knowledge made the case feel tragically solvable, a haunting reminder that closure was possible if only one person decided to speak. For the families, that was the hardest part to live with. It wasn't just that their daughters were gone, it was that the system designed to protect them and punish those responsible had failed. They had navigated decades of false hope, misleading reports, and political grandstanding, only to find themselves back at the beginning, still waiting. Birthdays passed, anniversaries came and went, and life moved on for the world around them. But they remained suspended in time, tethered to a December night in 1991 that never released its grip. In the broader conversation about justice, the yogurt shop murders continue to serve as a painful benchmark. It was a case often cited in conversations about the cost of rushing to judgment, about the danger of ignoring due process, and about the irreversible damage done when evidence is mishandled or suspects are coerced into false confessions. But to those most affected, it wasn't a lesson or a lecture. It was a wound that refused to close. The longer the case remained open, the heavier its presence became. It was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about proving that time doesn't have to win, that silence can be broken, and that even in the most frustrating, agonizing of cold cases, justice is still worth pursuing. No matter how many years have passed. By the 21st section of the yogurt shop murders case, the burden of unanswered questions had become a quiet companion to those who had followed it for decades. In every retelling, every anniversary vigil, and every courtroom flashback, there was a tension, an invisible thread pulling together decades of grief, failed attempts, public outcry, and a justice system that had moved in circles. What had once been a desperate push for answers had settled into a grim endurance test, one where the finish line remained invisible and justice felt more like an idea than a reality. The emotional cost of such a long-standing cold case couldn't be measured only in court files or DNA swabs. It lived in the memories of friends who had survived the girls, in the conversations parents had with their younger children about what happened back then, and in the quiet acknowledgement by residents that this case, more than any other, had left a scar across Austin. The city had grown, modernized, and rebuilt itself around new industries and a rapidly expanding population. But this story had never left. It lingered, like smoke that had never quite cleared from the scene of the fire. The law enforcement agencies involved had rotated through waves of personnel. Each generation of detectives handed the file with a mixture of reverence and frustration. Cold case units often described it as the case that haunted their desks, because it embodied so many of the failures that modern investigative methods were designed to prevent: contaminated evidence, rushed conclusions, mishandled confessions. But with each new review of the case, the investigators weren't just trying to piece together what had happened. They were trying to undo decades of cumulative error without causing more harm in the process. This unique blend of legal and moral complexity meant that any potential prosecution had to be approached with an unprecedented level of caution. Mistakes made in the early 90s had taught everyone involved that a rush to justice could be just as damaging as a lack of it. The original suspects, after all, had been publicly tried not just in courtrooms, but in newspapers and on television. Their reputations destroyed, their freedom revoked, and their names forever associated with a crime they may not have committed. The justice system had been forced to walk back those conclusions, but the damage was irreversible. That historical weight now loomed over every possible future action. There was also the burden of technology's limitations. While the unmatched DNA profile remained the strongest piece of forensic evidence, it had still yielded no direct hits despite being uploaded and cross-referenced through multiple databases. It was the kind of evidence that was simultaneously promising and cruel. Concrete proof that someone had been there, that someone was responsible, but with no name to assign to it. Genealogical tracing had made massive leaps, but those leaps still required a stroke of luck. A distant relative uploading their DNA to the right database, giving investigators the one thread they needed to pull the entire case forward. That level of dependency on technology, combined with the aging nature of the case, highlighted an uncomfortable reality. Time was no longer a passive obstacle. It was now actively working against justice. Witnesses had died. Memories had faded. Physical evidence had degraded beyond further analysis. And the public's attention, while still present in certain circles, was gradually shifting toward newer cases, newer tragedies, newer names and headlines. Yet there remained a group of people, families, advocates, legal scholars, retired officers, who refused to let the case slip quietly into obscurity. Their resilience wasn't born of naivete. They understood how cold cases worked. They understood how rarely they found resolution after so many years. But their insistence came from something deeper, the belief that the girls deserved more than silence. that the families deserved more than annual apologies and vague reassurances. That closure, even if delayed, mattered. This determination gave rise to new strategies in the form of public involvement. Campaigns were launched to encourage DNA uploads to public ancestry databases. Billboards were funded to keep the girls' names in public view. Podcasts and documentaries helped introduce the case to younger generations who hadn't been alive in 1991, but who were now captivated by its mystery and injustice. These efforts weren't just about remembering the past. They were strategic attempts to shake loose new information, even if it came from the most unexpected of sources. Meanwhile, legal reforms that had slowly evolved over the years could be traced, in part, back to the mistakes made in this case. Coercive interrogation practices, lack of legal counsel during questioning, mishandling of forensic evidence. Each had played a role in the wrongful prosecutions. And now, future suspects in other cases were better protected precisely because of what happened during the yogurt shop investigation. In that way, the victim's legacy had extended beyond the case itself. It had influenced policies, shaped academic discussion, and altered the path of criminal procedure for the better. Still, none of that changed the core truth. The case remained unsolved, and no amount of policy change or retrospective analysis could fill the void that 4 young girls had left behind. Their lives had been brutally stolen, and for over 3 decades, the question of who had done it had remained unanswered. Every year that passed made that question more painful, more urgent, and more symbolic of the gaps still present in a justice system that promises resolution, but too often delivers delay. And so, the story carried on, not because of breakthroughs or new developments, but because silence had never been an option for those who cared. It lived through the photographs still framed on parents' mantles, through the voice of a retired detective who still kept a file in his drawer, through the community that lit candles each December. In the face of so much loss, that persistence became its own kind of justice, unfinished, imperfect, but unwilling to fade. By the 22nd section of the yogurt shop murders case, the passage of time had etched deep lines not only in the lives of the victims' families, but across the very framework of how justice was pursued. As the decades stretched forward, the absence of definitive answers became a defining feature of the case, a symbol of both human resilience and institutional paralysis. What had begun as a horrific act of violence against 4 teenage girls in 1991 had evolved into a haunting benchmark of everything that could go wrong in a criminal investigation. Yet the refusal to let the story die remained just as potent as ever. Over the years, public opinion had shifted in complex and sometimes polarizing directions. For a time, it had focused heavily on the original suspects, their supposed confessions, and the prosecution's confident declarations of guilt. But the slow unraveling of those cases, marked by legal appeals, DNA exclusions, and eventual reversals of convictions, had forced people to reconsider what they believed. Doubt had crept into the narrative, and for many, it was no longer just about finding who did it. It was about understanding how so many things had gone so terribly wrong. Legal experts continued to dissect the case in academic journals and criminal justice symposiums. It had become a cautionary tale in law schools, a vivid example of why due process matters even in the face of overwhelming public pressure. Prosecutorial conduct, police interrogation tactics, forensic reliability, all these components were now examined through the lens of the yogurt shop case. The girls' deaths had become more than a tragic loss. They were a sobering reminder of how institutional shortcomings could compound the suffering of those already grieving. Meanwhile, a quiet but growing movement of citizen sleuths and independent researchers had taken root online. Forums dedicated to unsolved crimes often featured long, detailed threads analyzing timelines, re-examining crime scene photos, and cross-referencing public records. These digital communities were not filled with conspiracy theorists or casual observers. They were composed of people who saw themselves as part of the effort to uncover the truth. Some had backgrounds in criminal justice, others in data science or journalism, and many were simply motivated by a deep sense of injustice that still clung to this case. Their collective work had, in some cases, brought fresh attention to overlooked angles, alternate suspects, inconsistencies in witness statements, and even obscure details from old news clippings were unearthed and reevaluated. Although none of these civilian efforts had yet led to a breakthrough, they serve an important purpose. They kept the pressure alive. They reminded the public and authorities that this case was not just a historical footnote. It was still active, still open, still demanding answers. The psychological toll on the families, however, remained immeasurable. For them, time had not healed. If anything, it had only made the pain more complicated. Every passing year represented a milestone their daughters would never reach. Graduations, weddings, careers, all stolen in a single act of violence that had yet to be properly acknowledged with justice. Parents and siblings who once appeared before cameras with hopeful eyes had grown quieter, more guarded. Their words, when spoken, carried the weight of weariness. And still, they showed up to every hearing, every update, every anniversary vigil, because to disappear would feel like abandoning their daughters all over again. In the background, law enforcement continued their work. Despite the challenges, the cold case remained on the books. Periodic updates from police and prosecutors suggested ongoing efforts. New DNA comparisons, reanalysis of trace evidence with more advanced tools, and quiet interviews with individuals who had drifted in and out of the original investigation. These updates rarely yielded groundbreaking results, but they indicated that someone was still paying attention. And in a case as old and convoluted as this one, even the smallest bit of momentum mattered. Technology, too, remained a source of cautious optimism. Genetic genealogy had cracked cases once thought impossible to solve, and many hoped it could do the same here. The hope was that a relative of the unknown perpetrator might one day upload their DNA to a genealogy database, creating a match that would allow investigators to build a family tree leading back to the killer. But it was a long game, one reliant on a combination of patience, luck, and meticulous research. Throughout it all, the haunting reality remained. Someone had gotten away with murder. Not just any murder, but the brutal, calculated execution of 4 innocent teenage girls. That someone had walked away from a burning yogurt shop on that cold December night in 1991 and managed to live their life while 4 others had theirs stolen. That chilling truth had never faded from public consciousness. It had simply become harder to bear. As the case moved toward yet another year without resolution, one thing remained constant: the resolve to see it through. Whether it came from aging detectives reviewing old files, journalists keeping the story alive, digital sleuths working through theories, or families holding onto a thread of hope, the drive for justice had not disappeared. It had only transformed. No longer loud and demanding, it had grown quiet and persistent. But it was still there. And in a world that often forgets, that persistence meant everything. By the 23rd section of the yogurt shop murders case, the investigation had entered a realm of quiet urgency. Every movement now felt like a race against time. Not just in solving a case, but in salvaging the integrity of a system that had long struggled under the weight of its own failures. The passage of decades had reshaped how the case was perceived, not merely as a tragedy frozen in time, but as a living reminder of unresolved trauma, flawed justice, and the persistence of hope in the face of unrelenting silence. Among the remaining fragments of physical evidence, the unknown male DNA profile continued to be the centerpiece. Despite numerous efforts, including testing against known felons and volunteers, there had been no definitive match. Each negative result brought a wave of disappointment, but also a renewed focus. Technology had advanced far beyond what was available in 1991, and forensic specialists believed that with the right resources, the elusive identity might still be discovered. The problem was no longer just technical. It was logistical. Funding, time, manpower, and interagency cooperation all played roles in how far and how fast the investigation could move. Parallel to the forensic developments, legal advocates and civil rights organizations began to re-engage with the case. The original mishandling of suspects, particularly the coerced confessions from young men in the early 1990s, became a subject of renewed scrutiny. These cases were no longer seen in isolation. They were placed within a larger context of systemic issues surrounding wrongful convictions, inadequate legal representation, and law enforcement's over-reliance on confessions in the absence of physical evidence. The yogurt shop case, once a local nightmare, had become a national case study in what not to do during a high-profile investigation. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative features continued to retell the story, often with newly uncovered insights or rarely seen archival materials. These productions reached broader audiences than ever before, ensuring that the memory of the four girls and the questions surrounding their deaths would not fade into obscurity. With each retelling, new voices joined the conversation. Journalists unearthed inconsistencies, former detectives offered clarifications or expressed regrets, and legal analysts drew direct lines between the case and contemporary criminal justice reform movements. Still, for many in the Austin community, especially those who remembered the fear and mourning that gripped the city in 1991, the unanswered question remained the same. Who could do something so brutal and disappear without a trace? This persistent question sparked quiet but growing interest in revisiting individuals previously dismissed or never considered. The original pool of persons of interest had been wide, including former employees, acquaintances, and known offenders in the area. Some names resurfaced over the years in unrelated crimes, while others had seemingly vanished. There were whispered theories, often too fragile to stand up in court, but not easily ignored either. Some suggested the involvement of more than one perpetrator. Others believed the key lay in someone close to the shop or the victims, someone who knew enough to avoid early suspicion. Despite these speculations, law enforcement remained tight-lipped about any current leads. The frustration among families and the public was understandable, but investigators understood the stakes. Any move toward indictment or prosecution now would need to be backed by overwhelming, indisputable evidence. Another failure in court could not only further traumatize the families, but potentially close the door to justice forever. The lessons of the past, particularly the overturned convictions, loomed over every decision. Meanwhile, the families continued to endure an unimaginable kind of grief. They had survived long enough to see suspects arrested and then released, public attention swell and then fade, and forensic science leap forward without yet offering resolution. Their grief was no longer just personal. It had become communal, shared by advocates, legal minds, and supporters who had joined their cause. The candlelight vigils, now held every December, were not just moments of remembrance. They had become calls for accountability, pleas not to forget, not to give up. What made the case particularly difficult was the sheer brutality of the crime. It wasn't just murder, it was calculated, cruel, and sadistic. The setting of a family-friendly yogurt shop made it all the more horrifying. This wasn't an isolated alley or a seedy backstreet. It was a well-lit business, one frequented by teenagers and families alike. The randomness, or at least the appearance of randomness, contributed to the lasting psychological damage inflicted on the community. The fact that someone could walk in, commit such a horror, and escape undetected challenged every assumption people held about safety, about neighbors, about evil. Even as technology and strategy evolved, the case remained a delicate balancing act between past errors and future possibilities. Those who studied the case in law enforcement circles understood the stakes. Solving it wouldn't just mean finally naming the killer or killers. It would be a signal to countless other cold case families that time does not always erase justice. That persistence can pay off. That silence can one day be broken. For now, however, the silence endured. Not because people had stopped caring, but because each careful step forward was weighed down by the fear of making the wrong move. The question was no longer whether the case could be solved, but whether the systems in place had the courage, the resources, and the humility to finally do it right. By the 24th section of a yogurt shop murder story, what remained was a layered and haunting portrait of loss, failure, and unwavering determination. Over 3 decades had passed since 4 teenage girls were found murdered in the back of a burning frozen yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. And yet, the weight of that night still pressed down on the community, the investigators, the families, and the very systems that promised justice. The case had become more than an unsolved crime. It was a symbol of everything that could collapse when urgency, public pressure, and flawed methods collide under the name of law enforcement. Despite the absence of closure, this case had never grown cold in the hearts of those connected to it. For the families of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Sarah Harbison, and Jennifer Harbison, each year that passed brought the same hollow rituals. Another anniversary marked by candles and silence. Another reminder that no one had been held accountable. Their grief had matured into something sharper and quieter, not because the pain had dulled, but because it had settled into their everyday lives. The space their daughters once filled had become a void lined with questions, each more exhausting than the last. What had begun as an urgent and chaotic investigation in 1991 evolved into a sprawling, complicated, and often embarrassing journey through multiple layers of the justice system. 2 young men, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, had been convicted years after the crime, only to have their cases unravel due to a lack of physical evidence and the suppression of DNA results that excluded them. Their convictions were overturned, and they were released, leaving the case once again wide open. Though the confessions had been dramatic, they were taken under questionable methods, with no corroborating forensic proof to substantiate the claims. The damage, however, had already been done. Trust in the investigation was fractured, and a cloud of doubt had formed over the very agencies assigned to protect and serve. This case had also transformed into an educational blueprint for future law enforcement officers and legal scholars. It was taught in classrooms not as a success story, but as a warning. How interrogation tactics can lead to false confessions. How tunnel vision can cause investigators to fixate on the wrong suspects. How forensic evidence, if ignored or mishandled, can not only stall a case, but actively mislead it. The yogurt shop murders became part of a curriculum, a symbol of how justice, if not grounded in objectivity, can lead to irreversible consequences. Meanwhile, technological advancements continued to offer hope, albeit with caution. With each passing year, new tools in DNA testing became more precise, more capable of extracting useful information from degraded samples. Genetic genealogy, the same technology that helped solve the Golden State Killer case, was considered a potential lifeline. But even here, the progress was slow. The unidentified male DNA profile recovered from the crime scene remained unmatched in existing databases. It was like a ghost, present, undeniable, and maddeningly incomplete. But hope had not vanished. Organizations devoted to solving cold cases had begun to take more interest. Independent labs offered their services. Private donors and advocacy groups provided funding to revisit and retest old evidence. There was a growing recognition that just because a case is old doesn't mean it's unsolvable. And the community, though weary, had never truly let go. News outlets continued to report on every development, no matter how small. Public attention may have shifted in waves, but it always returned, drawn back by the sheer horror and injustice of what happened to those 4 girls. In more recent years, law enforcement officials involved in the case, both past and present, had taken a more reserved tone. Statements were careful, cautious, no longer filled with bravado or certainty. Their updates were tempered with the knowledge that the public expected not just results, but accuracy and fairness. The mistakes of the past still cast long shadows. Any future action would require an airtight case, irrefutable evidence, and a full understanding that the cost of getting it wrong again would be devastating. The yogurt shop murders weren't just a crime. They were a fracture in the fabric of an entire city. Austin had changed dramatically since 1991. The strip mall where the crime took place had been rebuilt. The original shop long gone. New businesses, new faces, new memories. And yet, the space remained hallowed ground in the minds of many. People still stopped by. Some left flowers. Others just stood in silence. The city had grown, but it had never truly healed. For those closest to the case, the pursuit of justice had never been about revenge. It had always been about acknowledgement, about truth, about reclaiming some small measure of peace for lives that were taken so violently and so unfairly. Whether that moment will ever arrive remains uncertain. But what's clear is that the story is not over. The file is still open. The questions are still being asked. And the need for resolution, real, unshakable resolution, is still as strong as it was the day the flames were put out and the nightmare began. As the years slip by, the echoes of that December night in Austin remain. A case marked by unspeakable horror, missteps in justice, and enduring grief, still unresolved, still haunting. For young lives were taken, and decades later, the silence that followed remains louder than ever. If justice is ever to be served, it must begin not with forgotten files, but with remembrance, vigilance, and truth. Because some crimes never sleep, and neither should our pursuit of answers. You've been listening to another disturbing true crime bedtime story, where shadows linger long after the lights go out. This is MrDarXnights, where nightmares are real and justice never rests. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a chilling tale before bed. Until next time, stay aware, sleep safe, and remember, some monsters don't hide under the bed. They walk among us.